Hello, I'm Ted Gioia, and I'm doing a series of unscripted video talks on subjects relating to music and its impact on culture. Today I'd like to ask, do we really need to own our music, or can we just stream it? For most of the last 500 years, the music industry has had just one big thing it worried about. It wanted to convince people to buy music. This really started in the 1600s with the advent of music publishing. Before that, if you wanted to disseminate your music, you usually had to travel. You sold your music in the flesh, and you did it by performing. If you wanted your music to go to Belgium, you had to go to Belgium. If you wanted your music to go to Italy, you had to go to Italy. But finally, with the rise of music publishing, you didn't have to travel anymore. And now your music could travel all over the world, and you could stay at home. This was probably the single biggest breakthrough in the economics of music in the whole history of song. But at first the changes were slow because it was difficult for musicians to collect royalties. Often they even had to subsidize the cost of music publishing back then. And the print runs were very small. Back in the 1600s, you might only print 500 copies or 1,000 copies. But a significant change was underway. And gradually the publication of music changed everything. By the time you get into the 1900s, we start to hear of songs selling 1 million copies. We hear that Oh Susanna by Stephen Foster sold 1 million copies. We're told that the Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin sold 1 million copies. And around the same time, intellectual property laws start getting more solid, and musicians can finally collect a reasonable income on the songs they write. By the time we get to the early 20th century, you can now make a very good living as a musician and never perform at all. In the case, for example, of songwriter Irving Berlin, he couldn't even perform. He could hardly play the piano, but this didn't stop him from being one of the highest earning musicians of the 20th century, and was able to do that just by selling physical products. At first that was the sheet music, then it became the record. And this gradually became the foundation of the whole music economy. It became the foundation of the livelihood of virtually every musician on the planet. So an amazing thing had happened. Musicians had learned how to sell what they did. They turned it into an object, a commodity, a physical object, and people would buy it. And with the rise of the record industry, this became the whole foundation of the business of music. But now this has changed. Just in the last few years, we've seen an amazing change, and people no longer buy music. They stream it. They listen to it on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Music. And we need to ask, is this a positive change? Is it good for the music ecosystem? Is it good for the musician's livelihood? Is it good for the fan? Is it good for our broader culture? Music industry revenues reached their peak in 1999. Today, they're about half of what they are back then. So the first thing you notice is the size of the industry is shrinking. And that's not a good sign. But I'd like to focus on the psychology of ownership because I believe that's just as important as the economics, maybe even more so. Because I believe there's a deep connection between people owning music and their loyalty and commitment to it. In fact, I would say almost all of the key aspects of music over the last 100 years were spearheaded by music collectors. The whole music industry was built on collectors. And even the historical aspects of music were built on collectors. I've personally known most of the early researchers in blues music. These are the people that long before academics were interested in blues, long before grant-giving organizations were interested in blues, they made field trips into the Deep South to preserve this music. And the interesting thing is, every one of them was primarily a record collector, and their interest in preserving the music came out of their activities as record collectors. So if you talked to Samuel Charters and asked about how he became a blues researcher, it started with record collecting. My friend Mac McCormick did amazing work in studying the life of Robert Johnson and the great Texas and Mississippi blues musicians. But if you talked to Mac for more than a few minutes, you got a sense that he saw himself primarily as a collector. Is this just coincidence that the people who collected the music and wanted to own it took the most fervent steps to preserve it? Well, we've seen that in other instances as well. Much of the early music in our culture, even the early recordings, has disappeared. And in many instances, it was preserved solely because of record collectors. Take the example of Paramount Records. Paramount was one of the greatest record labels in the early history of 20th century American music. Yet in the Great Depression, when Paramount got into trouble and their financials were sinking, they shut down their factory, and in fact, they threw all the masters and the old records into the river, into the Milwaukee River. Some record collectors would even go diving to try to preserve these things. And today, we've been able to keep this music alive solely because record collectors held onto it when the very company that made it did not preserve it. We've seen the same thing in film. Do you know that 90% of the movies made before 1929 are lost to us completely? And the ones that we do have were almost always preserved by a collector. They held on because they valued the ownership. And in an environment in which creative work was just streamed, this would have all disappeared. So can we really trust streaming companies to preserve our artistic culture and legacy? Consider the case of Netflix. A few years ago, 6,000 movies were available on Netflix. Now it's only 4,000. And of the movies they make available, few of them were made before the year 2010. It's almost as if the whole history of Hollywood and cinema doesn't exist for Netflix. Because of the market pressures, they have to focus on current hits. So do you want to trust Netflix to preserve the history of cinema? Let's ask the same question about music. Do you want to trust Spotify or Apple to preserve the whole history of music? Think about it. Right now you have a wide range of musical offerings that you can stream. But as costs go up and as the storage costs increase, will Spotify really have a commitment to 1920s jazz, or Native American music, or old blues, or other traditional songs? It's very unlikely. So if we create a situation in which our whole musical culture resides in streaming, we put the legacy and the history of our songs at great risk. So I would suggest that we need to revitalize the ownership of music. And this can be done. Our record labels had a long history of innovation in creating physical products. Columbia Records created the long-playing record. RCA created the 45 RPM single and invented stereo recording with EMI. And then you had Sony with the Walkman. You had record labels would create innovations in physical music that would create that desire to own. It's only in the last 20, 30 years that record labels stopped investing in research and development. Because they did that, they've handed the music industry off to Apple, to Google, and high-tech companies. Is this good for us? I suggest that this puts music at great risk because these large tech companies do not love music. They do not need music. They don't even need to make money off music. Google will give away music for free to sell advertising. Apple would give away music for free to sell a device. Because they don't have a strong economic vesting in the health of music, we cannot trust these tech companies to preserve it. So we have moved to the streaming model. We no longer buy music as like a library, and we can go check out whatever we want. But I suggest that we need to re-examine this. We need to look at ways of revitalizing the physical album. And we need to ask ourselves, do we want to own or do we just want to stream? Because I would say that if we believe we want to borrow music, music itself may be on borrowed time.